Hey folks, today we are going to do the second part of our Eastern Theater video, talking about Chancellorsville to Appomattox. So if you remember kind of where we left the Eastern Theater, it was really bad for the Union, the worst battle that they fought, Fredericksburg, where basically we have General Lee just kind of asking for Burnside to be in charge all the time because the battle is just terribly managed by the Union. This leads us to Chancellorsville. You can see it here. It's pretty close to where um, Fredericksburg is. And Chancellorsville is another big battle for the Confederacy. And so they're kind of following up their big success. Remember, the goal here is to get the Union to quit, and probably the best way to do that would have been to take Washington, D.C. But obviously, the Northern Army's not just going to let that happen. And so at this point, it's under new leadership. This time, Joseph Hooker, General Joseph Hooker, is in charge of the Union forces. And so basically, what happens at Chancellorsville is that Stonewall Jackson kind of comes up with a bold strategy. He realizes that the Union Army on the very western side, or the left side, if you're looking at this picture, had not protected its flank well. And so all he had to do was go like 15 miles through the woods and the wilderness in order to get there. And the Union kind of thought that it couldn't be done. And so Thomas Jackson, General Jackson, basically under the cover of nightfall, orders his troops on a forced march. They march 15 miles through what they call the wilderness, and basically show up where they're not supposed to be. And after that forced march, they then attack immediately. I can't imagine how tired his troops would have been, but it's a major surprise. It's a major defeat for the Union Army. They're not able to get their stuff together. A lot of supplies are actually lost in the battle as well for the Union, and so it's a really bad way. There's our gold star, and by this point, Robert E. Lee decides that he is going to go and pay Washington, D.C. a visit. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, the cost of Chancellorsville is pretty steep. Stonewall Jackson actually walks through a picket line. He's surveying his troops at night. There's a lot of confusion about who is where. And he actually gets shot by his own troops in the arm. And when he gets shot in the arm, he then kind of has to have his arm amputated. He gets sick, and he actually dies from his wounds from friendly fire. And Jackson is kind of the probably historians have definitely argued he is the best general on both sides of the war. He kind of understood how to fight in the Civil War. It's often said that generals fight the last war with this year's weapons. And Jackson kind of got a sense for how warfare was changing, and he really knew how to take advantage of it. But General Lee did not know as much. And so big loss for the Confederacy. Probably not the reason why the Confederacy loses, but it definitely didn't help. So General Lee is going to Gettysburg. Gettysburg, you can see here on the map, is he's trying to sneak in the back door of Washington, D.C. Gettysburg is a 4-day battle. We're going to talk about those days here. So on the first day, General Reynolds here kind of gets to the battle first. He's on cavalry, which means he's on horseback. Horses are not the best way to fight, and the Confederates kind of show up here. You can see where they're coming from on day one. And Reynolds kind of recognizes that if he does not protect the ground, you can see all of these high ground, these mountains here and ridges. And he recognizes that basically the Union has an opportunity, if they can get and keep this high ground, to have a huge strategic advantage. But he also recognizes that has to happen. George Meade is kind of known. They actually said, Abraham Lincoln said about him later that he had a case of the slows. He didn't make decisions very quickly or decisively. In this case, Reynolds it probably deserves the credit for actually winning the entire battle of Gettysburg, because he gets to that high ground and he keeps it. Day 2 focuses on what we call here the round top. So you've got big round top and little round top. I'll let you guess which one's which. The big one's the big mountain. But basically, especially Little Round Top, this is where you get the story of the 20th Maine that's in the movie Gettysburg. They hold their ground, take really heavy casualties, but the Confederates actually almost managed to advance through the woods and take the high ground. And if they had taken the high tops, they would have rolled cannons up there. And being on the smaller hills is no benefit to you when somebody on a bigger hill has a cannon that they can just kind of shoot you with. But that doesn't happen. That's day 2. And so here we have the other kind of argument, and this has been made by a couple of people, that Stonewall Jackson may have advised against this entire battle. It's not like the Confederates needed to attack this way. And Jackson may have been able to convince Lee that this was not a great idea. Lee was much better defensively than offensively as a strategist. James Longstreet, you can see him here. Definitely some beard love for the brother, but not so much as far as getting Lee to follow what he's talking about. And so Lee does it anyway, and that kind of leads to a tragic outcome for the Confederates. Day 3, we call Pickett's charge. Basically, Lee decides that he's going to throw everything he can at the center of the Union line. This requires them to march over a mile across an open field, up a slight hill, while taking heavy fire from Union cannons the entire time. And so Pickett doesn't necessarily think it's a good idea, but he also knows his place. He doesn't push back against Lee, and agrees to do it. What's important to note about the Battle of Gettysburg is that even though it's probably not the best strategy for the Confederates, they actually pull it off pretty well. And all 3 days, the Confederates come very close to winning, but don't quite get there. And so that's kind of the 3 days. The 4th day is just a retreat. And again, like we said, George Meade has a case of the slows, and he does not follow the Confederates as they retreat. A lot of his other generals kind of encouraged him to attack, to take advantage of the Confederates while they were retreating. Meade does not do that. And so this causes Lincoln to lose all faith in George Meade. By the way, we haven't really highlighted it in these videos, but this is a common theme. Lincoln changes his commanding officer of the Army of the Potomac like 7 or 8 times. It was George McClellan, George Meade. He also tried Hooker and Burnside. He's just kind of looking for a guy that really fits what he's after. And after Gettysburg, he turns to Ulysses S. Grant, and basically wants that Grant to do the same thing. Grant still recognizes that the North, remember when we talked about their benefits, it's that economy, and Grant kind of recognizes that fact. And so really we can summarize 1864 and 1865 as Grant basically haunting Robert E. Lee like he's Casper the Ghost, and fighting Robert E. Lee is his unfinished business. Basically, he follows Lee's army around everywhere and starts a fight every single place that he can. Whether it's favorable to the Union or not, he basically orders them to attack, inflict heavy casualties. He takes heavy casualties as well, but he also refuses to leave battlefields until the Confederates retreat. As long as the Confederate army is sitting in front of him, Grant's going to attack it to cause those casualties. It's a really bloody affair. It's not, like I said, you might want him to be your leader because he recognized what the Union had to do to win, but you didn't want to be in his army if you wanted to survive, because it's brutal. But that takes us to Appomattox Courthouse, where Lee surrenders to Grant. Grant basically allows the Confederates to go home as long as they agree to never fight again, which they do. And so at Appomattox Courthouse, we basically have the end of the Eastern Theater. Technically not the end of the Civil War. There's still some fighting going on in Texas and other places. But once the Eastern Theater is over and the Western Theater is over, that Anaconda strategy is kind of finished. And the Civil War is basically over. That's it for us today. Next time we'll talk about what happens after the Civil War.